Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
So in this episode, I'm going to introduce you to Edward Hall, who is an American anthropologist who maybe was the first to do some comprehensive research on cultural dimensions. And in the next episode, we're going to be introduced to Geert Hofstede's work, which is what we're going to continue with for at least the following 6 episodes. Nevertheless, I want to introduce to you Edward Hall as well for a few reasons. Firstly, because Hall preceded Geert Hofstede in his research. Well, these two people often work together. So Geert Hofstede was, I would say, inspired by Edward Hall's work. And therefore, I think it's important that we all know first a little bit about Hall's research before going on to Hofstede's. Edward Hall was an American anthropologist, born in 1914 in Missouri, USA. He's known for his cross-cultural studies, which helped to gain understanding and information about cultures around the world. Hall's work focused on the cultural factors that influenced human behavior and interactions. And he's particularly famous for coining terms like proxemics, high and low context cultures, and monochronic versus polychronic cultures. We'll talk about these later. And while working for the US State Department and Foreign Service Institute, Hall observed that many people display a certain bias in intercultural situations, judging people from other cultures by how they act in certain situations, while remaining unaware of the role that culture plays, especially your own culture. In his 1959 book, The Silent Language, Hall explained this ethnocentrism in this quote: "When it becomes apparent to people of different countries that they are not understanding one another, each tends to blame it on those foreigners, on their stupidity, deceit, or craziness." Throughout his career, Hall introduced several new concepts, including proxemics, monochronic and polychronic time, as well as high versus low context cultures. And these concepts are related to 3 key cultural dimensions, which Hall proposed, many years ago, which are related to context, time, and space. So, let's dig a little deeper into what these 3 dimensions are. First of all, context. Hall's context theory states the significance of context varies in communication between countries. For example, in high context cultures like Japan and Brazil, communication is often subtle and indirect. Therefore, according to Hall, it's important in these cultures that you read between the lines. That's because in high context cultures, it's not just the words that are important, but maybe how they are said, who is saying them, and in what situation. On the other hand, in low context cultures, such as the Netherlands or even Germany, it's not so necessary that you understand the context of a situation in order to understand what is being said and what is needed. So, for example, in an organization, in a work culture, in a high context environment, if your boss says you should do this or you should do that, maybe it's not always the right thing just to listen to exactly the words they're using, but maybe how they're saying them, or what are the other underlying motives, what are the other aspects of the situation which might affect how you should behave or how you should act. Whereas in a country like the Netherlands, if the boss tells you to do that or do this, you can trust usually that you can take their words at face value. That is to say that you don't need to think, he said this or she said that, but maybe she's just being nice and actually I should do this instead. Because in high context cultures like Japan, you cannot always take what is said at face value. Things like gestures or metaphors or the history and let's say the relationship between people is more important. So if a boss says that you can go home, maybe that doesn't mean you should go home, because maybe it's a test, for example. It's quite famous in Japan that if you're a new employee, at least traditionally, in an office, that you shouldn't leave the office until your boss leaves the office. So this is quite understood cultural norm in Japan. Whereas in a low context culture like Germany or the Netherlands, if your boss tells you you can leave, it's probably fine that you leave. There's no tricks here. You don't have to look at how he's saying it. You don't have to look at the gestures that your boss is using, but rather you can take what they say at face value. That's because low context cultures like Germany and Scandinavian cultures are more direct and open in their communication. That means if they say something like something is good, they mean it's good. If they say it's bad, they mean it's bad. If they say you can do something, you probably can. If they say you can't do something, you probably can't. Whereas in the high context cultures, like I said, you cannot always take what is said at face value. Maybe somebody tells you you can do something or you can't do something, but it's a bit more complicated. Can you think of any example in your culture? Please let me know in the comments. So knowing about this cultural dimension of context, high versus low context cultures, you can see how it's important, or it could be very useful to know about this if you're working with people from other cultures, especially if, let's say, you're German, so maybe you're used to a low context culture. Remember, low context means you can take what is said at face value. But let's say you're German and you live in Japan. And your boss tells you, like I said, oh, when you finish your tasks, you can leave the office. So the German thinks, great, I finished at 4 p.m., so I'm going to leave the office. But then the next day, the boss isn't talking to you. Maybe one of your colleagues says, why did you go home so early yesterday? You cannot do that. And the German might say, well, the boss said when I finish my task, I can go home. But in high context cultures like Japan, we cannot always rely on the words being said, but it's all about the context. Maybe the boss was just trying to make you feel comfortable, trying to feel at home. But really, if you're a new employee in Japan, you probably can't leave at 4 p.m. without some negative consequences.
Thank you for listening and or watching today's episode of the More Than English podcast. Today you were introduced to Edward Hall, and we looked at one of his dimensions, which was high versus low context cultures. In part 2, we'll explore the other two dimensions of Hall's, which are proxemics, related to space, and monochronic versus polychronic cultures, which is related to time. And now a quote from Edward Hall himself. Culture hides more than it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Finally, here's today's key vocabulary. To precede, to be or go before something or someone in time or space. To coin a phrase, to invent a new word or expression, or to use one in a particular way for the first time. Ethnocentrism, judging one's own race or country as superior to others. To read between the lines, to find meaning other than from what is directly written or said. Underlying, real and genuine, but not immediately apparent or obvious. And finally, to take something at face value, to accept something as it appears to be, without further examination. Thanks guys, see you in the next episode.